Sahana vavatu, sahano bhunaktu, sahavidyan karavavahai, tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Chaitanyam sarvagam sarvam sarvabhutaguhashayam yat sarva vishayatitam tasmai sarvavide namaha. Om. Good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to the many students attending this class regularly online. Just a quick comment. I mentioned this to Vasanti before. In a class like this, taking up a fairly sophisticated text, one expects over a period of time there will be natural attrition, which means students will drop out. They'll just feel this is more than I can handle. And I suspect several years ago, 2 years ago or so, when we began this class, I suspect there was some attrition at that time. But in the past months, I've noticed that this class is growing in size, which I find highly unusual. And that's reflected online also. There are more students, many more students watching this class online. And this is not an introductory text, as we've discussed before. And that at first that struck me, why is that so? And the reason, I think, is it's such a brilliant text. I studied this long ago, and with the commentary, and every morning I would go through and do my study, and it struck me as very solid Vedanta, but nothing really. A few sections, I think, excited me, but mostly it was all teachings that I had seen before. There's something, though, about sharing this text with all of you that really brings it to life, in a manner of speaking. So I feel a kind of excitement about teaching each week's class that I didn't feel each morning when I was studying it on my own. It was just me. In fact, there were three of us. Who are those three? Me, Shankara, and the commentator, this Ramakrishna, who lived some hundreds of years ago. So that's it. So every morning the three of us would together, but it didn't have the feeling associated with it was quite different than this. Anyway, I'm just blabbering a little bit here at the beginning just to share this observation with you. Okay, let's come back to our text. Making our way through this 17th chapter. The topic is experience, and only Advaita Vedanta could spend so much time analyzing ordinary experience. And let me underline something here before we begin. So many people start off in spiritual life with a wrong conception that some kind of unique, special spiritual experience is required for enlightenment. Some kind of samadhi, some kind of lights going off in your head, something like that. And it turns out that with Shankara's help, we can easily see that a thorough analysis of an ordinary experience, like what is happening right now, is absolutely adequate. If you trace this experience back to its roots, this experience is more than adequate. Analyzing this experience is more than adequate to lead you to enlightenment. No special experience is required. So, with that introduction, we continue. As I said, the basic principle of experience is there is an experience that takes place in your mind, and there is an experiencer. And please note that all experience takes place in your mind. As we've discussed in other sessions, the Swami you see and hear right now is not identical to the one sitting in his chair. The Swami you see and hear right now is one sitting in your head, so to speak. So, which means all experience truly takes place in your mind. With that in mind, we will pick up the thread. Sorry about that. Apayod bhutihi nabhir, apayod bhutihi nabhir, nityam dipyan raviryata, nityam dipyan raviryata, sarvaga sarvadrik shuddhaha, sarvaga sarvadrik shuddhaha, sarvam janati sarvada, sarvam janati sarvada. Start in the second line. Ravihi, yatha, yatha, just as Ravihi, one of the many words for sun. The sun, dipyan, is shining. Nityam, constantly. The sun is shining constantly. In the first line, apaya udbhuti hinabihi. Hinabihi, the sun shines without udbhuti, arising, and apaya, setting. The sun shines constantly without rising and setting. So the sun has risen here in India. The sun has set, or is setting. I'm not sure about the time exactly. So notice this perspective of rising and setting is from our perspective on the earth. Suppose you were sitting not on the earth, but on the sun, of course, metaphorically. If you were metaphorically sitting on the sun, would it rise and set? It would be shining continually. So notice it's a matter of perspective when we say the sun rises and sets. And the same thing is true of consciousness. When you say you were unconscious last night in deep sleep, from what perspective are you speaking? Who says those words? Does consciousness utter those words? Does consciousness say, I didn't exist last night in deep sleep? Consciousness doesn't have thoughts, doesn't have words, reveals thoughts and words. Obviously, that's from the perspective of your mind. Or if a doctor pronounces a patient as being unconscious, that's not even from the perspective of the mind, that's a perspective of another mind. These are remote perspectives. So if we shift our perspective to the perspective of consciousness, just as from the perspective of the sun, there's no rising or setting, from the perspective of consciousness, there's no such thing as unconsciousness. In deep sleep, after death, in any situation whatsoever, from the perspective of consciousness. So this consciousness, the consciousness which is your true nature, the consciousness which is present in this ordinary experience right now, the consciousness because of which you know what's happening right now, the consciousness because of which you see and hear the Swami who's sitting in your head, so to speak. What about that consciousness? And this is where Vedanta kicks in, because that consciousness is known to you in general, but you don't know that the certain features, important features of that of that consciousness, such as, in the third line, that consciousness is sarvagaha, all pervasive. It's not stuck inside your body. All pervasive. The sun metaphor, for those of you who like a little bit of science, it's interesting to use the sun metaphor to describe all pervasive. How far does the sun's light reach? Obviously, it reaches the earth, but is that it? It stops at the third orbit from the of planets? No, the sun keeps shining. It shines on all the planets. Does the sun stop shining at the end of our solar system? No, continues to shine. Where does it stop? From the standpoint of science, if you think about the sun as emitting photons, energy packets of light, those photons travel outwards from the sun for how long? Until they hit something. They don't stop. They have no mass, therefore there's no energy to slow down. There's nothing to slow them down. So they travel forever, which means the light of the sun travels to the edge of the universe. It does. Not that much light reaches there. Might be 1 photon every billion years, but it means it still shines. So interesting that of course, Shankara didn't know anything about photons, but that metaphor of the sun works. Its light is sarvaga, all pervasive. The light of consciousness is sarvaga, all pervasive. It's not stuck inside your head. We'll see that in the next verse. Since that consciousness is sarvaga, it is sarvadrik, the seer or witness of all. The same consciousness that reveals the Swami sitting in your head is the same consciousness for everyone else in this room, revealing the Swami sitting in their heads, which is the same consciousness revealing what's happening in my mind and in every mind of every conscious being. That's what sarvadrik means here. When we say that consciousness is all-knowing, it's all-knowing in that sense, as a consciousness present, revealing the activities of every mind. Further, and really importantly, that consciousness is shuddha. A good example of a word that we just say, yeah, I know what shuddha means. It means pure. Then what? Wait a minute. What does pure mean? When you say your consciousness is pure, we use that expression in English, pure consciousness. What does that mean? What is impure consciousness? There is no such thing. But pure consciousness is best understood as in this way. Your consciousness remains utterly unaffected by anything it reveals. So if it reveals a Swami sitting in your head, I suppose that's a good thing. If it reveals the smell of a pile of stinking garbage, not so good. But the point is that consciousness is utterly unaffected by both of those experiences. And that's crucial. This is really where the phala, the fruit of Vedanta, is realized, and that is the purpose of Vedanta. You've heard this many times. Vedanta is not a philosophy. It's a solution to the problem of suffering. How is it a solution to the problem of suffering? Right here, shuddha. When you understand that the consciousness present in your experience right now is utterly unaffected when sadness is sitting in your head. That's it. Sadness can sit in your head without affecting you, consciousness. Freedom in spite of that sadness. This is a truth to be understood, to be realized, Shuddha. So therefore, that consciousness, sarvam janati, consciousness knows everything, reveals what's happening in every mind, sarvada, continually. Just like the sun's light shines out into the furthest reaches of the universe. So notice what Shankara did in this verse. He shifted perspective. So often our perspective is, we're all naturally extrovert by nature. So our perspective is one of extroversion out there. And what Shankara does is he reverses that view, that perspective. And from the perspective of consciousness, there's no coming, there's no edge, there's no boundary, there's no stop, there's no start. Okay, that principle of being all pervasive is expanded upon in this next verse. Anya drishti sharirastas, anya drishti sharirastas, tavan matro hyavidyaya, tavan matro hyavidyaya, jalendwad upamabhistu, jalendwad upamabhistu, tadharma chavibhavyate, tadharma chavibhavyate, jalendwad upamabhistu. I'm just looking to see if it violates a rule of meter. It's okay. It turns out it's just a little odd to chant. Okay. So back up at the top. That end of the second line. He avidyaya. He, because of avidyaya, because of ignorance, because of the failure to recognize the true nature of the consciousness present in this ordinary experience, because of that experience, what happens, back up at the top, is anya drishtihi, where the seer is anya, the experience. Drishti here, experience, where the experience is anya, different, separate, where you have your own experience, I have my own experience. There are so as many people as there are in this room, there are that many experiences, as many as there are online as well. How many experiences? Fine. How many consciousnesses? Experiences are many. Consciousness is one. And Shankara is going to use the metaphor we've used of before of one light, one sun or one moon shining on many buckets of water. You've all heard that metaphor before. Many buckets of water. The reflection in every bucket of water is a little different. But the sun or moon reflected in every bucket of water is not different. Therefore, this anya drishti, this conclusion of my consciousness, and my consciousness is actually an improper expression. We use it a lot because it's practical to speak of your consciousness and my consciousness. But on examination, there is no my consciousness, your consciousness. There is no anya drishtihi, individual experience. There is only one all-pervasive consciousness. But avidyaya, due to ignorance, sharirastaha. It seems to be staha, stuck inside of this sharira. Consciousness seems to end right here, right? Why? Isn't it kind of arbitrary? You're thinking, that's not arbitrary at all. That's my end of my skin, that's my arm. Okay, So you think consciousness ends there. What happens? You've had this when you sleep on your arm at night and it's numb? Just consciousness is not inside your arm when it's just numb from sleeping. So that means consciousness is prevented from entering your arm. Is that silly, right? So isn't this kind of arbitrary? And arbitrary in the sense that it's the fancy word is it is an artifact of your nervous system. I know that's a fancy expression, but the sense of consciousness being stuck inside our body is an artifact, a side effect, so to speak, of the way our nervous system works. So a nice mental experiment. Imagine, you don't have to close your eyes for this, but just imagine you were blind, you were deaf, and your body was numb, head to toe. Imagine being blind, deaf, and numb. And then a thought arises. You still have a mind, right? You can still think. I didn't say you couldn't think. So you are blind, deaf, and numb, and you can still think. Suppose you ask yourself the question, where am I? Being blind, deaf, and numb, how would you answer that question? You would have no sense of location whatsoever, right? Our sense of location comes from our relationship with the world around us. If we can't see, hear, or feel the world around us, that connection is broken. Our sense of location is an artifact of our senses. Consciousness has no location. Sarvadrik. Sarvaga is a word he used before. That consciousness is indeed all pervasive. But avidyaya, due to ignorance, due to the artifact of our senses, consciousness seems to be stuck inside the body, and consciousness seems to be tavat matraha. Tavat becomes tavan due to grammar rules. Tavat matraha, this big only. Consciousness is the size of your body. So this is something that's puzzled people in all religions. How big, they'll call it soul. How big is the soul? In some religions, the soul is infinitesimal. In some religions, the soul is vast. In some religions, the soul is exactly the size of the body. Actually, Jaina, in the Jain tradition, that's exactly their vision, that the soul is the size of the body. Anyway, all of that is an artifact. And then Shankara uses that metaphor we just described. He says, Jalendu, in the third line, Jalendu Adi, we have to break these words apart, Jala Indu Adi Upamabihi to, but Upamabihi, because of this explaining by this metaphor. What metaphor? Jala Indu Adi. Indu is moon. The moon, which is Jala, reflected in the bucket of water. Adi, etc. So based on this, the image that Shankara is painting here is the moon shining on many buckets of water. You see the moon reflected in each bucket of water, but each bucket, first of all, the buckets are different sizes and shapes. The buckets represent our bodies, different sizes and shapes. Some of these buckets were made in America, some were made in India, some were made in South Africa. Do I remember right? No. Kenya. and other places as well. So the buckets are made in different places, but so the buckets are different. How about the water inside those buckets? Our minds. How different is your mind, my mind, and every mind? Absolutely different. Some similarities, I suppose, but the differences are far greater than the similarities. So that moon reflected in all these buckets is going to look entirely different in each bucket. Entirely different. In the same way, consciousness reflected in all of our minds is reflected in vastly different ways, but one moon, many reflections, one consciousness, many reflections. Then Shankara gets a little bit more technical here. He says, tad dharmaha cha vibhavyate. What you see reflected in the bucket, vibhavyate, it reveals tad dharmaha. Here dharma means a quality, a property. Be careful, words have many meanings. The dharma of water is to be wet. Dharma is used in that sense, especially in a philosophical context. And that's the context in which it's used here. So, tad dharma vibhavyate. When you look at the moon in each bucket, the moon you see reveals the dharma, the properties or traits of that individual bucket and its water. So just as the nature of the reflected moon is conditioned, we like that word in Advaita Vedanta, very helpful. We say that the image of the moon is conditioned by the bucket and water. In the same way, we can say that the manifestation of consciousness in your mind is conditioned by the nature of your body and mind. By the way, just on a technical note, and I don't want to get in, this is a big technical topic, I don't think this is the right place for it, but conditioned consciousness conditioned by your mind is what we mean by the word experience. What is experience? Experience is consciousness conditioned by your mind. That's all it is. And that makes it so clear, so precise, this definition of experience. Okay. That's good. Let's continue. Drishtva bahyam nimilyata, drishtva bahyam nimilyata, smritva tat pravihaya cha, smritva tat pravihaya cha, aton milyatmano drishtim, aton milyatmano drishtim, brahma prapnotya nadvargaha, brahma prapnyota nadvagaha. Drishtva bahyam, waking state. Smritva, what you remember, dream state. And unmilya, in the third line, deep sleep state. This is just to get the overview of this verse. The first line is talking about waking state, second line dream state, third line deep sleep. And what Shankara is doing here is using one of the many, many prakriyas, methodologies used in Advaita Vedanta to analyze experience and lead us to the nature of consciousness. He's using actually a prakriya that has its origin in the famous Mandukya Upanishad. The Mandukya Upanishad is famous for its use of Om in a metaphoric way. It says, let the of Om represent the waking state. Let the U of Om represent dream state. Let the Ma of Om represent deep sleep. And the purpose of that text, and Shankara's use of that text, is this. When you're chanting Om, Om, by the way, I hope none of you chant Aum. Please don't. Please don't. This deconstruction of Om into Ma is a grammatical deconstruction. It's absolutely not meant for pronunciation. A lot of people have misunderstood that today. Anyway, Om is pronounced Om. If you're not sure about that, I have a video. You watch the video. And I don't want to talk about it. And people love to argue about that. Oh, people are they're really attached. I've been chanting it Aum all these years, and you're telling me it's wrong? How dare you? Anyway. And I find it very amusing when people get attached to their pet ideas. All right. So this grammatical deconstruction of Om into Ma represents our experience, waking state, dream state, and deep sleep. And the significance of it is when you're chanting Om, 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 before each Om is silence. After each Om is silence. Does silence get destroyed? Suppose we think about silence as a fundamental reality. This is a metaphor. You don't think in terms of sound waves and all of this stuff. This is not science, this is a metaphor right now. Suppose we think of silence as the ground of reality. From the ground of reality, Om arises. And then, when you're chanting Om, that makara, makara means a letter, ma, finally it resolves into silence. Om arises from silence. Om resolves into silence. That silence represents an underlying reality. Underlying realities don't come and go. Therefore, it remains present during Om. So Om, if this hand represents that underlying reality, silence, then Om, before Om, there's silence. During Om, there's silence. And when Om resolves, it's silence. That silence remains present throughout. Again, using silence as a metaphor. And this silence, then, metaphorically represents consciousness. Consciousness exists before you wake up in the morning. Consciousness exists after you wake up. Consciousness exists when you fall asleep and dream. Consciousness exists when you stop dreaming and enter the state of deep sleep. So this is the idea that Shankara uses here. It's actually a formal contemplation. And I don't want to bore you with, there's a lot of details about that, but we'll just it's a contemplation on the three states of experience. Drishtva bahyam, after having experienced the external world, waking state. Atta, at the end of the line, atta, then nimilya, having resolved that waking state experience. Having resolved could be when you fall asleep, but it could also be having resolved through contemplation. And that's really the meaning. Both meanings are fine, but let's take the contemplation meaning, because I think that's really Shankara's intention here. So having resolved in a sense of contemplation means you know that consciousness existed before you woke up. You know consciousness exists while you're awake. You know consciousness exists exactly the same when you fall asleep. That's what Shankara means by nimilya, having resolved waking state experiences into unchanging consciousness. This is what he means. Unmilya, having resolved waking state experiences into pure consciousness. Smritva, and then having dreamed. Smritva tat, then having dreamed about whatever you experienced in a waking state can pop up in your dream state. So smritva tat, having remembered that, having projected that in a dream state, and cha, and then pravihaya. Pravihaya means the same as nimilya, having resolved. So in this contemplation, first, waking state experiences are resolved into consciousness. Then dream state experiences are resolved into consciousness. And then, third line, atta, and then unmilya atmanaha drishtim. And then, having resolved those experiences, unmilya, having resolved both the experiences of waking state and dream state, having resolved drishtim, all of those waking and dream experiences, atmanaha, into oneself, into that underlying substratum which is pure consciousness. So here Shankara is presenting that teaching of the Mandukya Upanishad for the sake of contemplation, to recognize that these three states of experience, by the way, we should call deep sleep state is not a state of experience, it's a state of, it's a state of experiencing nothing. Is the best way to describe it. In a waking state, you experience bahya, what's around you. In the dream state, you experience smritva, what arises from your memory. And then in deep sleep, you experience nothing. So these three states of experience, and since that's a common expression, many people make this mistake. There are three states of experience. There are three states of the mind. How many states of consciousness are there? So many people make that mistake. In fact, probably more people make the mistake than have it right. So there are three states of experience, three conditions of your mind. How many states of consciousness are there? In fact, better to say there are no states of consciousness. Consciousness is unchanging. That which is unchanging doesn't undergo various states. So, these three conditions, waking, dream, and sleep, arise and disappear. Our definition of reality is that which doesn't come and go. So, according to this, waking state is less real than consciousness. Consciousness doesn't come and go. Dream state is less real than consciousness. Deep sleep state is less real than consciousness. What is real is consciousness. And that consciousness is what's present in your experience right now. That consciousness is the ultimate meaning of the word I. Actually, that topic will come in a few more verses. That consciousness is your true nature. So, to use this three states of experience in this contemplation, as Shankara does here, this is called a prakriya, a means, one of the many teaching methodologies employed in Advaita Vedanta. And through this teaching methodology, Brahma prapnoti, one discovers Brahman, the absolute reality. When you discover the unchanging consciousness, that unchanging consciousness is Brahman. If you say, how can consciousness be, how can my consciousness be Brahman? Well, my consciousness can't be Brahman. When you get it, that there is no my consciousness, there's only all-pervasive, unchanging consciousness, then you can understand and discover that unchanging, all-pervasive consciousness is indeed Brahman. Brahman prapnoti anadvagaha. Adva is a path. Advaga is going down another path. Anadvagaha, without, that's why I translated it literally here, without going anywhere else, but I don't think that's what Shankara means here. I think he's talking about prakriyas. The commentator doesn't mention anything about it, but I think Shankara is intending here, this prakriya is all you need. You don't need any other prakriya. You don't need any other teaching methodology. If you get it, that these three states of experiences come and go, and you are the unchanging, limitless consciousness by which this alternation is witnessed. If you really get that, Brahman prapnoti, you're done. Nothing else is required. Of course, for most people, a lot more is required, but Shankara here is pointing to the centrality of this particular prakriya. A few of you may know of the works of this Swami Sat-chit-ananda, this famous and controversial Swami who lived in Karnataka. He said that this is the main prakriya. He put a lot of emphasis. By the way, if you don't know about him, you're lucky, because he's a very controversial figure. But if you do know about him, he put a lot of emphasis on this prakriya. Okay, let's see one more verse. Pranadyevam trikam hitva, pranadyevam trikam hitva, tirno jnanamahodadhim, tirno jnanamahodadhim, swatmasto nirguna shuddho, swatmasto nirguno shuddho, buddho mukta swato hi saha, buddho mukta swato hi saha. Now, this is a good verse to conclude this topic. Pranadi evam. Prana here, Shankara used this word in several verses before in previous classes. Prana represents the dream state. It's a not very obscure, it's a somewhat obscure usage of prana. He's referring to the dream state, prana, adi, etc. The dream state, etc. means waking, dream, and deep sleep. Jagrat, swapna, and sushupti. Evam, thus, trikam. These three states, can I fool you? 3 states of consciousness? I'm not going to fool you. Okay, you get it. These 3 states of experience, hitva, having recognized that your true nature is utterly independent of those 3 states of experience. Hitva means giving up, and giving up in a metaphoric sense, recognizing that they come and go, you don't. That's it. So hitva, recognizing your absolute independence of these 3 states of experience. In this way, tirnaha, one crosses ajnana mahodadim. Mahodadim is ocean or sea. The sea of ajnanam, the sea of ignorance. Ignorance is not a little puddle. It's a vast sea of ignorance. And when I say that, ignorance is incredibly complex. And let me be more specific. Ignorance, we're not talking about, different kinds of ignorance. Do you know the C++ programming language? No, that's a very specific kind of ignorance. Who cares about that? That's not what we're talking about, the sea of ignorance. That's one kind. There's a sea of intellectual ignorance. Okay. That's not what we're talking about. The sea of ignorance we're talking about is this. The result of ignorance of your true nature, as sat-chit-ananda atma, the immediate effect is identification. Identification with your body, mind, senses, and everything else. When you say, I am, fill in the blank. Tell me, if you say that sentence, I am, how many words could you use in that blank that follows? Any limit? You could go on and on and on forever. I am this, I am that, I'm this, in different situations, I'm that, etc., etc. It goes on and on and on. That is the vast sea of ignorance. The various kinds of identification you have with your body and mind. When you say, I am this or that, all of those statements are wrong. Because you are not a this, you are not a that. You are sat-chit-ananda atma, Brahman, unchanging, limitless consciousness. But no one says that. We've joked before, when you meet someone for the first time, do you introduce yourself? I am unchanging, limitless consciousness. Even an enlightened person won't use that language because no one will understand. They'll think you're nuts. Okay. But it is the truth. So, a person who recognizes that, in the last line, that person is Buddha, enlightened. Buddha, literally, one who has woken up from the sleep of ignorance. That person is Buddha, enlightened. In the third line, that person is swatmastaha, established in one's true nature. What is that true nature? The true nature that Atma is nirgunaha, without properties. So the most common mistake we make is that when sadness arises in your mind, it becomes a property of you. You own the sadness. Who says? It comes and goes. You observe the arrival of sadness. You observe the end of sadness. And the observer is utterly unaffected throughout the whole thing. To take sadness or any other mental event as a guna, as a property that belongs to you, is a mistake. Unchanging. The metaphor that we've used so many times is that the crystal remains utterly clear in spite of the appearance of orange. The orangeness of the crystal represents sadness in your mind. It looks orange, it's not. It seems sad, it's not. Any more than the crystal is affected. So therefore, nirgunaha, free from the properties of the body, mind, and senses. Shuddhaha, again, that word we used before. What does it mean? Pure. It means utterly unaffected by whatever happens in your mind. So that person who is Buddhaha, enlightened, is muktaha, liberated? When? Everyone, not everyone, but many people ask this question. When did you become enlightened? They like that question. When did you become enlightened? Well, if you are sat-chit-ananda Atma, which is identical to Brahman, when did you become sat-chit-ananda Atma? Atma has always been identical to Brahman, which means when you get it, when you become enlightened, you recognize that I've always been that limitless, all-pervasive consciousness. Therefore, the person is swataha muktaha hi saha. He indeed, saha, that person, is swataha muktaha, by nature enlightened. Consciousness never got into a state of bondage. Even now, consciousness is utterly unaffected by all the nonsense in your life. There's a lot of nonsense in our lives, and we all know that. Enlightenment doesn't depend on anything in your life changing. Enlightenment depends on knowing that all that nonsense doesn't truly affect you. This is the teaching of Advaita Vedanta, and that's a really good place to conclude for today. We'll continue next week. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, kaschad dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma satgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om Tat Sat.